Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Santa Barbara harbor as Michael Brennan made his final preparations to set sail. At 42, with salt and pepper hair that had seen its share of ocean spray, Michael had been sailing most of his life. The creases around his eyes had deepened with years of squinting against reflective waters, giving his weathered face a perpetual look of contemplation. Today was meant to be a simple solo day trip. Just him, his 28-foot sloop Windseeker, and the Pacific Ocean. "Weather's supposed to hold until tomorrow afternoon," said Ray Gonzalez, the harbor master, leaning against a piling as Michael checked his rigging. "Are heading up the coast again?" Michael nodded, securing a line with practiced efficiency. "Just past Point Conception if the winds cooperate. Need to clear my head." Ray understood without further explanation. Everyone at Santa Barbara Harbor knew that Michael had been struggling since his divorce finalized 6 months earlier. These solo sails had become more frequent, his way of processing the end of a 15-year marriage. "Just keep an eye on the marine forecast," Ray cautioned. "They're saying there might be some unexpected swells coming in from that storm system offshore." "Always do," Michael replied, patting the pocket where he kept his marine radio. "I've got emergency equipment, and my EPIRB is freshly tested." The emergency position indicating radio beacon was standard safety equipment for serious sailors, capable of alerting search and rescue services if activated. Ray nodded, satisfied. Michael was experienced and cautious, not the type to take unnecessary risks. "Well, fair winds. See you tomorrow." After a final systems check, Michael cast off the mooring lines and guided Windseeker out of the harbor. The morning air was crisp, carrying the distinctive scent of ocean and diesel exhaust that permeated all marinas. Once clear of the harbor, he raised the main sail, feeling the familiar tug as it caught the breeze. The auxiliary engine fell silent as the wind took over, and Michael felt the day's first genuine smile cross his face. This was freedom. Out here, the complications of life ashore seemed to dissolve with each nautical mile. No divorce papers, no empty house, no well-meaning friends with their constant concern, just the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull and the creak of the rigging overhead. Michael checked his GPS and charted a course northwest toward Point Conception, the elbow where California's coastline bent eastward, known among sailors as the Cape Horn of the Pacific, for its often challenging conditions. He wasn't planning to round the point today, just sail in its vicinity before turning back. The forecast predicted 15-knot winds, perfect sailing conditions. For the first several hours, the journey progressed exactly as planned. Windseeker cut through the water with satisfying speed, while Michael alternated between active sailing and letting the autopilot take over while he enjoyed a simple lunch of a sandwich and an apple from his provisions. He kept his phone in a waterproof case, occasionally checking the marine weather app, which continued to show favorable conditions. By early afternoon, he had made excellent progress. The Santa Barbara coastline had receded into a distant line, of civilization behind him, and the wild, less populated stretches north of Gaviota were now visible to port. Michael checked his position. He was about 12 miles offshore, which was farther out than he'd initially planned, but still well within his comfort zone. It was then that he noticed the first signs of trouble. The sea state had begun to change. What had been moderate, predictable swells were now coming from multiple directions, creating a confused chop. Michael frowned, checking the weather app again. The forecast remained unchanged, but his instincts, honed by decades on the water, were sending warning signals. He decided to err on the side of caution. "Time to head back," he muttered to himself, coming about and adjusting his course to return to Santa Barbara. As he did, he noticed the clouds on the western horizon had thickened considerably in the last hour. The barometer on his instrument panel showed a rapid drop in pressure, a clear warning sign. Michael tuned his marine radio to the weather channel, catching the middle of an updated forecast. Unexpected intensification of the low-pressure system approximately 100 miles west of Point Conception. Small craft advisories now in effect for waters extending from Point Conception to Morro Bay, with conditions expected to deteriorate rapidly over the next 4 to 6 hours. "Damn it," Michael muttered. He should have stayed closer to shore. Mentally calculating distance and time, he estimated he was still about 4 hours from Santa Barbara Harbor at his current speed, potentially cutting it close with the approaching weather. The wind was already picking up, shifting direction unpredictably. Michael reduced sail, reefing the main to present less canvas to the strengthening gusts. Windseeker was a solid, well-maintained vessel, but no small sailboat was immune to the power of a sudden storm. Within an hour, conditions had deteriorated dramatically. The wind howled through the rigging at over 30 knots, and spray from the breaking waves soaked everything on deck. The sky had darkened to an ominous slate gray, and visibility had dropped to less than a mile. Michael had donned his foul weather gear, bright yellow waterproof jacket and bib pants, and clipped his safety harness to the boat's jackline, i.e., safety line running the length of the deck. His hands, protected by sailing gloves, gripped the wheel with determination as he fought to keep Windseeker's bow pointed into the increasingly formidable waves. He considered his options. Continuing toward Santa Barbara meant having the growing storm on his stern quarter, a potentially dangerous point of sail in these conditions. The nearest safe harbor, Cojo Anchorage near Point Conception, was closer but would require navigating tricky waters in deteriorating conditions. The decision was made for him when a particularly violent gust caught the boat, causing it to heel dangerously. As Michael scrambled to adjust, he heard a sharp crack from above. Looking up through rain-streaked eyes, he saw that the main halyard, the line holding up the mainsail, had parted. The sail collapsed in a chaotic tangle, flapping violently in the wind. "No, no, no!" Michael shouted over the wind as he quickly engaged the engine. The auxiliary motor roared to life, but he knew immediately it wouldn't be enough to make significant headway against both wind and waves. He needed to secure the flailing mainsail before it caused further damage. Carefully unclipping and reclipping his safety harness as he made his way forward, Michael fought for each foot of progress along the heaving deck. The boat pitched beneath, him making every movement treacherous. Salt spray stung his eyes as he reached the mast and began to wrestle with the wildly flapping canvas. It was during this struggle that disaster struck. A rogue wave, significantly larger than the already substantial swells, appeared seemingly from nowhere. Michael had only a moment to register the towering wall of water before it crashed over Windseeker's portside. The impact knocked him off his feet, sending him crashing against the lifelines. Though his harness prevented him from going overboard, his head struck the winch with enough force to momentarily stun him. When his vision cleared seconds later, Michael realized with horror that Windseeker was rolled nearly onto her beam ends, side-lying in the water, with the mast parallel to the surface. Through years of sailing experience, he knew what was happening. The keel was failing to right the boat, which meant water was pouring in somewhere below. Fighting disorientation and the bizarre angle of the deck, Michael scrambled toward the cabin hatch. Before he could reach it, another wave crashed over the boat and Windseeker rolled further. The cold shock of Pacific water enveloped him as the boat capsized completely. For terrifying seconds, Michael was disoriented underwater, still attached to the overturned vessel by his safety harness. Training kicked in through the panic, and he managed to locate the harness release, freeing himself from the sinking boat. Kicking hard, he broke the surface with a desperate gasp, immediately searching for any sign of Windseeker. The sight made his heart sink. His beloved sailboat was already mostly submerged, with only a portion of the hull visible above the churning waves. Everything had happened so quickly. From first noticing the changing conditions to capsizing had been less than 2 hours. Michael's survival instincts took over. Swimming to the partially submerged hull, he clung to it, knowing it provided both flotation and visibility if search and rescue were looking for him. His hand patted reflexively at his jacket pocket. The waterproof case containing his phone was gone, likely ripped away during the capsize. "The EPIRB," he gasped, suddenly remembering the emergency beacon. It should have activated automatically upon submersion, but there was no way to confirm this. He could only hope the signal was transmitting his position to the Coast Guard. As daylight began to fade and the storm continued to rage, Michael watched, with growing despair as Windseeker sank lower in the water. The small air pocket trapped in the hull was gradually diminishing. Within an hour, as darkness fell completely, the last visible portion of his boat slipped beneath the waves, leaving Michael alone in the vast Pacific. The storm was moving inland, which meant conditions were slowly improving, but this provided little comfort. As Michael floated in water he knew to be about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. His foul weather gear provided some insulation, and he had managed to inflate his personal flotation device, but hypothermia would become a serious threat within hours. Treading water and conserving energy as best he could, Michael tried to maintain hope. His EPIRB should have signaled his position. Ray knew his general sailing plan. Someone would be looking for him by morning, if not sooner. The night passed in a blur of cold, exhaustion, and intermittent periods where Michael thought he might be hallucinating. He sang to himself, recited old poems he'd memorized in college, anything to stay alert and fight the creeping numbness in his extremities. The storm had passed, leaving behind a disturbing calm and clearing skies that revealed a crescent moon and scattered stars. By dawn, Michael's situation had become dire. Despite his experience and relatively good physical condition, nearly 12 hours in cold water had pushed his body to its limits. His movements were sluggish, his thinking foggy. He hadn't seen any lights from ships or search aircraft during the night, which either meant his EPIRB had failed or rescuers were searching in the wrong area. As sunrise painted the horizon in ironically beautiful oranges and pinks, Michael's survival training reminded him that dawn and dusk were feeding times for many marine predators. The thought had barely formed when he felt something brush against his leg beneath the water. Michael's heart rate spiked, adrenaline momentarily cutting through the hypothermic fog in his brain. He scanned the water around him, seeing nothing but the endless blue expanse. Then, about 30 yards away, he spotted it, a dark triangular fin cutting through the surface before disappearing again. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse from thirst and exposure. "Not now. Not after all this." California waters were home to several shark species. Great whites were known to patrol these waters, especially around the Channel Islands and along the coast near pinniped colonies. Michael knew he was currently floating in what amounted to a transit zone for these apex predators. The fin reappeared, closer this time, moving in a lazy arc that suggested the shark was investigating rather than immediately hunting. Michael recalled his marine safety training. Remain still, don't splash. Try to maintain a vertical position in the water to minimize your silhouette from below. But theory was one thing. Practice while exhausted, hypothermic, and terrified was another entirely. He couldn't stop his ragged breathing or the trembling that had as much to do with fear as with the cold. The shark disappeared again, and seconds stretched into agonizing minutes with no further sightings. Had it lost interest? Michael allowed himself a flicker of hope, scanning the horizon once more for any sign of boats or aircraft. The attack came without warning. One moment Michael was treading water, the next he felt an enormous pressure around his left leg, like being caught in a vice lined with razor blades. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, sending shockwaves through his already compromised system. Water around him frothed red as the shark, which Michael's terror-stricken mind registered as a great white approximately 14 feet long, thrashed with its prey. The predator's momentum pulled Michael under the surface, where the full nightmarish reality of his situation became apparent. The shark's eye rolled white as it shook him, a behavior meant to incapacitate seals and sea lions. In a desperate act of self-preservation, Michael did the only thing he could remember from survival stories. He struck at the shark's sensitive nose and eyes with his right hand, putting every ounce of his remaining strength behind the blows. Whether it was his resistance or simply that the shark determined he wasn't its usual prey, the pressure suddenly released. Michael kicked to the surface with his uninjured leg, gasping for air and screaming in pain. The water around him was stained crimson. Michael knew he was bleeding heavily, which would only attract more predators. Through the haze of pain and shock, he tried to assess his injury. His left leg was still attached, but the shark's teeth had torn through his foul weather gear and deep into the flesh of his calf and thigh. The wounds pulsed with each heartbeat, sending fresh ribbons of blood into the water. Using his belt and the strap from his personal flotation device, Michael fashioned a crude tourniquet above the worst of the wounds on his thigh. The pain was excruciating, but the alternative was bleeding out in minutes. As he worked, he kept vigilant watch for the shark's return. The predator circled at a distance, its fin occasionally visible as it patrolled. Marine biologists might explain this as investigative behavior. Great whites often bite, and then wait to see if the prey is worth returning for. but to Michael it felt like calculated malice, as though the creature was waiting for him to weaken further. Time became meaningless as Michael fought to stay conscious. The sun climbed higher, its heat both blessing and curse as it warmed his upper body while accelerating dehydration. His mouth was parched, lips cracked from salt and sun. The tourniquet had slowed the bleeding, but he knew he couldn't survive much longer without rescue. It was then, in what Michael was beginning to accept might be his final hours, that he heard it, the distant but unmistakable thrum of an engine. Summoning what little strength remained, he turned toward the sound and saw a speck on the horizon, gradually resolving into the silhouette of a Coast Guard cutter. "Here," he tried to shout, but his voice emerged as little more than a rasp. Frantically, he waved his arms, splashing despite the risk of attracting the shark's attention again. The vessel seemed to be moving parallel to his position rather than directly toward him. They hadn't spotted him yet. In desperation, Michael removed the emergency whistle attached to his life vest and blew with everything he had. The shrill sound carried across the water, again and again, until his vision began to darken at the edges from the effort. Just when he thought he might lose consciousness, the Coast Guard vessel changed course, turning in his direction. They had heard him, or perhaps finally spotted his small form against the vast ocean. Relief flooded through Michael, closely followed by a wave of lightheadedness that threatened to pull him under. The shark, perhaps disturbed by the approaching boat and its engine noise, disappeared into deeper water. Michael kept his focus fixed on the rescue vessel, willing himself to remain conscious for just a few minutes more. The Coast Guard cutter approached cautiously, mindful of the lone survivor in the water. Michael could now see figures moving, on deck preparing rescue equipment. A voice amplified by a speaker carried across the water, "We're coming for you. Stay with us." When the vessel was within 50 yards, a smaller, rigid-hull inflatable boat was deployed with 3 Coast Guard personnel aboard. They approached quickly but carefully, scanning the blood-tinged water with experienced eyes. "Shark attack," Michael managed to croak as they reached him. "Left leg, lost my boat." "We've got you," said the rescue swimmer, a young woman whose name tag read Martinez, as she slipped into the water beside him. "I'm going to secure you to this backboard, and we'll get you onto the boat. Try to remain calm." With professional efficiency, the Coast Guard team extracted Michael from the water, mindful of his injured leg. Once aboard the inflatable, they applied proper pressure dressings to his wounds while radioing ahead to the cutter. Male victim, early 40s, shark bite to left leg with significant tissue damage and blood loss. Moderate to severe hypothermia, possible concussion, dehydration. As they transferred him to the larger vessel, Michael caught snippets of conversation between the crew. EPIRB signal received about 4 hours ago. Expanded search grid. Lucky we found him. Aboard the cutter, a Coast Guard corpsman administered IV fluids and pain medication while checking Michael's vital signs. The blessed relief from pain allowed him to think somewhat clearly for the first time in hours. "Your name, sir?" asked the corpsman as he worked. "Michael Brennan," he managed to reply. "I was sailing Windseeker out of Santa Barbara." "Mr. Brennan, I'm Petty Officer Wilson. We've got a helicopter inbound to airlift you to Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital. They have a trauma team standing by. Can you tell me what happened?" Through chattering teeth, Michael gave a condensed account of the storm, the capsize, and the long night in the water before the shark attack. The effort exhausted him, and he found himself drifting in and out of awareness as the medical team continued their work. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors announced the arrival of the medevac. Michael was carefully transferred to a litter and prepared for airlift. As they moved him to the deck, he caught a final glimpse of the Pacific Ocean, beautiful, deadly, and somewhere beneath its surface, the great white that had nearly claimed his life. The helicopter ride passed in a blur. Michael was only vaguely aware of the flight medic monitoring his condition and communicating with the hospital. The pain medication created a strange disconnect, as though he were observing his own trauma from a distance. When they landed at the hospital, the transition from helicopter to trauma center was seamless. A team of medical professionals swarmed around him, their voices overlapping with urgent professionalism. "Shark attack victim, significant blood loss. Get 2 more large-bore IVs. Type and cross for 6 units. Orthopedics and vascular need to be in OR2. The bright lights of the trauma bay were the last things Michael remembered before anesthesia claimed him. He awoke an indeterminate time later in the ICU, the steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell confirming he was still among the living. A nurse noticed his consciousness and approached the bed. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Julie. You're at Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital. You're stable now, do you understand?" Michael nodded weakly, his throat too dry to speak. Julie offered him a small sip of water through a straw. "You've been in surgery for several hours," she explained gently. "Dr. Reyes will be in soon to explain everything, but I want you to know that your leg is still there. The surgeons were able to repair much of the damage." This news brought tears of relief to Michael's eyes. In his darkest moments in the water, he had been certain he would lose the limb if he survived at all. Dr. Reyes, a compact man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, arrived shortly thereafter. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Dr. Reyes, trauma surgeon. You're a very lucky man. The shark, which based on bite radius and tooth pattern was almost certainly a great white, caused significant damage to your left quadriceps and gastrocnemius muscles, as well as lacerating the saphenous vein. However, it missed both the femoral artery and the major nerve pathways. If either had been severed, you likely would have died before rescue or lost the leg." Michael absorbed this information slowly. "Will I walk again?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "With time and intensive rehabilitation, yes," Dr. Reyes replied. "You'll need additional surgeries in the coming weeks for skin grafts and possibly muscle repair, but barring complications, I expect you to regain approximately 85–90% function. You're relatively young and were in good physical condition before the attack, which significantly improves your prognosis." The doctor continued his explanation of the treatment plan, but Michael found his attention drifting as exhaustion pulled at him. Before leaving, Dr. Reyes added, "There are some Coast Guard officers who'd like to speak with you when you're feeling up to it. They're trying to piece together what happened for their report." Over the next 2 days, Michael's condition stabilized, enough for him to give his statement to Lieutenant Commander Rojas and Ensign Thompson from the Coast Guard. They recorded his account of the storm, the capsizing, and the subsequent shark attack. "Your EPIRB worked as designed, Mr. Brennan," Lieutenant Commander Rojas explained. "We received the initial signal approximately 14 hours after your estimated time of capsizing." 14 hours? Michael frowned. "That can't be right. It should have activated immediately upon submersion." "Sometimes they get tangled in debris or temporarily malfunction," Ensign Thompson offered. "The important thing is that it eventually transmitted, which allowed us to establish a search grid. We've documented other incidents of delayed activation." Michael wasn't entirely satisfied with this explanation, but was too exhausted to press further. The officers continued with their questions, particularly interested in the shark encounter. "Can you estimate the size of the shark?" asked Rojas. 14, maybe 15 feet, Michael replied, the memory sending a shiver through him despite the warm hospital room. White underbelly, black eyes until it rolled them back. Classic great white. "That matches what we'd expect in these waters," Thompson nodded, making notes. "There's been an increase in great white sightings off the California coast in recent years as conservation efforts have helped their population recover. The attack location you've described is within known feeding territories, particularly this time of year." Before leaving, Rojas handed Michael a card. "We'd like to send a marine biologist from the Shark Research Committee to speak with you. Dr. Eleanor Chen specializes in shark behavior and attack analysis. Would you be willing to meet with her?" Michael nodded, though the prospect of reliving the attack in scientific detail was not appealing. "If it helps prevent something like this happening to someone else?" "Sure." As promised, Dr. Chen visited 2 days later, a serious woman in her 40s with a clipboard and recording device. Unlike the Coast Guard officers, who had been primarily concerned with the logistics of the incident, Dr. Chen was focused on the shark's behavior. "Mr. Brennan, I'm sorry about what happened to you," she began, "but your account could provide valuable data. Great white attacks on humans are relatively rare, and survivors who can provide detailed observations even rarer." For the next hour, Michael painstakingly reconstructed the encounter, describing the shark's approach, the attack itself, and its behavior afterward. Dr. Chen listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. "Your description is consistent with what we call an investigatory bite," she explained. "Great whites don't have hands to explore their environment, they use their mouths. They're primarily looking for blubber-rich marine mammals, not humans. When they bite a human and don't get the high-calorie meal they're expecting, they typically don't persist with the attack. "Tell that to my leg," Michael said dryly. Dr. Chen acknowledged his point with a nod. "I don't mean to minimize what happened to you. These investigatory bites can still be catastrophic for humans. We're simply not built to withstand them. But understanding the behavior helps us develop better safety protocols and public education." "So why did it stay nearby afterward?" "It circled for quite a while." "That's particularly interesting," Chen said, leaning forward. "Great whites sometimes practice what we call bite and wait behavior. They bite prey and then wait nearby to see if it dies, or becomes incapacitated before returning to feed. The fact that you remained active and then the Coast Guard arrived likely disrupted this pattern." The clinical discussion of his near-death experience was surreal, but Michael found it oddly therapeutic. Reducing the terrifying encounter to scientific terms somehow made it more manageable in his mind. As Dr. Chen prepared to leave, she hesitated. "Mr. Brennan, I should mention that your case will likely attract some media attention. Shark attacks make headlines, especially in California where beach tourism is significant. If reporters contact you, you're under no obligation to speak with them." Her warning proved prescient. By the following day, several local news outlets had somehow learned of the incident. The hospital's phone lines were busy with requests for interviews, all of which Michael declined through the hospital administration. Ray Gonzalez visited that afternoon, visibly shaken by what had happened to his friend. "Christ, Mike, when they found Windseeker's emergency locator beacon but no boat, we thought you were gone." "Almost was," Michael replied, gesturing to his heavily bandaged leg. "The harbor's been buzzing about it. Some reporter from the local paper was asking questions yesterday. I didn't tell them anything," Ray assured him. Despite Ray's discretion, a brief article appeared in the Santa Barbara Independent the next day. Local sailor survives shark attack after boat capsizes. The piece contained basic facts but few details, as neither the hospital nor the Coast Guard had released specific information. This modest coverage might have been the end of it, had the story not been picked up by a national news aggregator looking for human interest content. By the end of the week, as Michael was being moved from the ICU to a regular hospital room, the narrative had grown more sensational with each iteration. "Sailor fights off great white shark after 24 hours adrift," and "Man survives nightmare at sea, shipwreck and shark attack." A producer from a cable documentary series specializing in survival stories left 3 messages with the hospital. Michael instructed the staff to deny any connection to the incident, preferring to focus on his recovery rather than becoming a momentary media sensation. Dr. Reyes supported this decision. "The last thing you need right now is that kind of stress," he said during morning rounds. "Your body needs to direct all its energy toward healing." The healing process was arduous. 10 days after the attack, Michael underwent his first skin graft surgery, with donor tissue taken from his right thigh to repair the extensive damage to his left leg. The pain was significant despite medication, and the psychological impact of seeing his mangled limb during dressing changes was sometimes more difficult to bear than the physical discomfort. Physical therapy began while he was still hospitalized. Initially, simple exercises to prevent muscle atrophy in his uninjured limbs, gradually progressing to more challenging movements as his wounds healed. Melissa Torres, his physical therapist, became both tormentor and champion, pushing him beyond what he thought possible while celebrating each small victory. "The human body is amazing," she told him during a particularly difficult session 3 weeks after the attack. "The tissues we're working with now, they remember. They want to function the way they did before. Our job is just to remind them." Michael clung to this perspective on his darkest days, when the pain was overwhelming and the prospect of returning to any semblance of his former life seemed impossible. There were nights when he woke drenched in sweat, the nightmare of cold water and white teeth still vivid in his mind. The hospital arranged for him to speak with Dr. Sarah Levine, a psychologist specializing in trauma. Their first session was awkward, with Michael resistant to the idea that he needed psychological help. "I'm alive, my leg's still attached, I'll be fine," he insisted. Dr. Levine nodded, unperturbed by his defensiveness. "Those are the facts, yes, and they're important to acknowledge, but trauma isn't just about what happened. It's about how your mind processes what happened. The body keeps score, Mr. Brennan. Over subsequent sessions, Michael gradually opened up about the fear that had taken root alongside his physical injuries, not just fear of sharks or the ocean, but a more existential dread about his own vulnerability. The experience had shattered his sense of control, a sensation that was particularly difficult for someone accustomed to self-reliance. "I keep thinking about how random it all was," he confessed during their fourth meeting. "If I'd checked the weather one more time before going too far offshore, if I'd reacted faster when the halyard broke, if the Coast Guard had found me an hour earlier or later." "That's common after traumatic events," Dr. Levine explained. "We try to identify the moment where a different choice might have led to a different outcome. It gives us the illusion of control in situations where we actually had very little." "So what's the alternative? Accept that we're all just rolling dice every day?" Michael asked bitterly. "Not exactly. It's about recognizing what you can control and what you can't, and finding peace with both." She paused, studying him. "You were a sailor before this happened. You understood that the ocean has its own rules, its own power. You respected that, prepared for it as best you could, but ultimately knew that nature has the final say. That perspective might serve you well in recovery too." This conversation marked a turning point in Michael's psychological healing. While he continued to struggle with flashbacks and anxiety, he began to integrate the experience into his understanding of himself rather than allowing it to define him entirely. 6 weeks after the attack, Michael was discharged from the hospital with a comprehensive outpatient rehabilitation plan. His left leg, while significantly scarred and still partially immobilized in a specialized brace, had been saved. He would walk again, though Dr. Reyes cautioned that the journey was far from over. "You're looking at 6 to 9 more months of intensive physical therapy," the surgeon explained during their final consultation. "There will be good days and bad days. The nerve damage will cause ongoing pain and occasional hypersensitivity, but based on your progress so far, I'm optimistic about your eventual outcome." Returning to his house in Santa Barbara was both a relief and a challenge. The familiar surroundings were comforting after weeks in the sterile hospital environment, but the emptiness, once a painful reminder of his failed marriage, now seemed to emphasize his physical limitations as well. Michael had been fiercely independent before the attack. Now simple tasks like showering or preparing meals required careful planning and sometimes assistance. A home health aide visited 3 times weekly, and friends from the harbor community organized a meal delivery rotation for the first month. Ray Gonzalez proved particularly steadfast, stopping by almost daily to check on Michael and help with household tasks. During one such visit, as they sat on Michael's deck watching the sunset, Ray broached a subject they had both been avoiding. "Insurance company called about Windseeker," he said, handing Michael a beer, his first since the accident, approved by Dr. Reyes. "They'll cover the loss, but they're asking about salvage possibilities." Michael shook his head. "She went down in deep water. Even if they could locate her, the cost of recovery would exceed her value." The acknowledgement brought an unexpected wave of grief. Windseeker had been more than just a boat to him. She had represented freedom, solace, possibility. "I figured as much," Ray nodded. "Just thought you should know they're asking." He hesitated, then added, "Have you thought about whether you'll sail again?" The question hung in the air between them. Michael took a long pull from his beer before answering. "Honestly, I don't know. Part of me says I need to get back on the water, face it down. Another part," he gestured to his damaged leg, "I'm not sure I'll ever have the physical capability again, let alone the nerve." Ray nodded, understanding the complexity of the decision. "No rush to figure it out. One step at a time, right? Isn't that what your PT Nazi is always saying?" Michael smiled despite himself. "Melissa would kill you if she heard you call her that." These moments of normalcy, joking with a friend, enjoying a beer at sunset, were precious islands in the ongoing sea of recovery. As weeks turned into months, Michael established new routines built around his rehabilitation schedule. 3 days a week at the physical therapy center, 2 sessions with Dr. Levine, home exercises, wound care, pain management. Recovery became his full-time job. 4 months after the attack, Michael's progress plateaued. The muscles in his left leg had largely healed, but nerve damage continued to cause problems with coordination and sensation. Some days were better than others, but he still relied on a cane for stability, and prolonged physical activity inevitably led to swelling and pain. During a follow-up appointment, Dr. Reyes was frank about the situation. "You've made remarkable progress, Michael, but I want to be honest with you. This is likely close to your new baseline. The remaining issues are primarily neurological, and nerve regeneration is unpredictable at best. You may see continued small improvements over the next year or two, but the most significant healing has already occurred." Though Michael had suspected this might be the case, hearing it confirmed was difficult. He had been holding on to the hope of eventually returning to his pre-attack physical condition, a possibility that now seemed remote. "So this is it?" he asked, gesturing to his leg. "The pain, the limp, the limitations, that's my life now." "I wouldn't frame it quite that way," Dr. Reyes replied carefully. "You've regained approximately 75% function in the affected leg. You can walk, climb stairs, drive a car, many activities of daily living. Yes, there are limitations, and likely always will be, but adaptations are possible." Michael knew the doctor was right, but acceptance remained elusive. That evening, he sat on his deck with a glass of whiskey, watching boats return to the harbor as the sun set. Among them were sailboats, not unlike Windseeker, their white sails catching the golden light. The sight stirred complex emotions: longing, fear, resentment, determination. The next morning, Michael made a decision. After his physical therapy session, instead of returning home, he directed his car towards Santa Barbara Harbor. Ray looked surprised to see him approaching the harbor master's office. "Didn't expect to see you down here today," Ray greeted him, eyeing the cane and Michael's careful gait. "Need to ask you something," Michael replied. "Who's good with adaptive sailing equipment around here? Modifications for people with disabilities?" Ray's eyebrows rose, but he didn't comment on the implication. "Marcos over at Pacific Marine Services. He's done work for the Veterans Sailing Program. Specialized seating, adapted controls, that sort of thing. Want me to introduce you?" Over the following weeks, Michael spent increasing amounts of time at the harbor, consulting with Marcos about equipment that could compensate for his limited mobility and strength. They discussed modified helm setups, simplified rigging systems, and safety enhancements. "I'm not talking about ocean crossings," Michael explained during one such meeting. "Just day sails, staying within sight of shore, but I need to know it's possible." Marcos, a practical man with weathered hands and thoughtful eyes, considered the specifications they'd outlined. "It's possible. Not simple or cheap, but definitely possible. You're thinking about getting another boat then?" Michael nodded, the decision solidifying as he spoke it aloud. "Something smaller than Windseeker, more manageable for one person, with limitations. I've been looking at Bristol Channel cutters, heavy displacement, forgiving handling characteristics." Word spread quickly through the close-knit harbor community that Michael Brennan was planning a return to sailing. Opinions were divided. Some admired his determination, while others questioned the wisdom of tempting fate after such a narrow escape. Michael ignored both perspectives, focusing instead on the practical challenges of his goal. 6 months to... The day after the shark attack, Michael stood on the dock beside Second Wind, a 28-foot cutter he had purchased with the insurance money from Windseeker and funds from selling his SUV in favor of a more practical sedan. The boat was older but meticulously maintained, with the modifications he and Marcos had designed already installed. Ray stood beside him, eyeing the vessel with professional assessment. "She looks good, Mike. Solid choice. I'm taking her out tomorrow," Michael said, the statement somewhere between information and invitation. Ray nodded, understanding. "I'll come if you want the company, or not if you'd rather do this alone." Michael considered the offer. His initial impulse had been to make this first voyage solo, to face the water on his own terms, proving something to himself. "But Dr. Levine's voice echoed in his mind. "Recovery isn't about proving your strength by refusing help. Sometimes it takes more courage to accept support." "I'd appreciate the company," he finally replied. "Just for this first trip. After that, we'll see." The following morning dawned clear and calm, perfect conditions for a maiden voyage. Michael arrived at the harbor early, methodically checking Second Wind's systems, despite having done so the previous day. Ray arrived as he was finishing, carrying coffee and pastries from the Marina Cafe. "Nice breeze building," Ray observed, handing Michael a cup. "Where are we headed?" "Just a short run," Michael replied. "Out past the breakwater and a bit along the coast. 2 hours, max." He didn't mention that he had calculated this route to avoid the area where Windseeker had gone down, where the shark had found him. They cast off without ceremony, Ray handling the lines while Michael managed the helm. The adapted controls worked, as designed, allowing him to compensate for his limited mobility. As they cleared the harbor entrance and the sails filled with the morning breeze, Michael felt something unlock inside him. Not quite peace, not quite joy, but a step toward both. Second, wind responded beautifully, cutting through the gentle swells with assurance. Michael found himself settling into the familiar rhythms of sailing, adjusting the sheets, reading the wind, feeling the boat's movement through the helm. His damaged leg ached from the activity and standing, but the discomfort seemed distant, secondary to the moment. Ray, sensing Michael's need for space, busied himself with small tasks around the deck, offering assistance only when necessary. They sailed in companionable silence for nearly an hour, making good progress along the coast. It was Michael who finally broke the quiet. "I didn't think I'd ever do this again." Ray nodded, understanding all that remained unsaid. "But here, you are." "Here I am," Michael agreed, making a small adjustment to their course. "Still terrified, if I'm honest. Every shadow in the water." He trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. "That won't ever completely go away," Ray acknowledged. "Shouldn't, probably. Healthy respect for what's down there is just good seamanship." Michael appreciated his friend's straightforward approach. No platitudes about conquering fear or inspirational nonsense about triumph over adversity. Just an acknowledgement of reality and the choice to proceed anyway. They turned back toward Santa Barbara as planned, completing the short journey without incident. As they approached the harbor entrance, Michael felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief at having made this first step, pride in his adaptation, lingering anxiety about the water beneath them, and a quiet sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with heroics and everything to do with simply continuing. Later that evening, as Michael sat on his deck with his customary sunset drink, he reflected on the day's significance. The shark that had nearly killed him was likely still out there somewhere, patrolling the waters off the California coast. Its attack hadn't been personal or malicious, just a predator following instincts honed over millions of years of evolution. The same ocean that had nearly claimed his life still beckoned, still offered both danger and solace. His phone buzzed with a text from Ray. "Good day on the water. Same time next weekend." Michael smiled slightly as he typed his reply. "Count on it." The scars on his leg would never fully fade. The pain would likely remain a constant companion, varying in intensity, but always present. His sailing would be curtailed, adapted, different from before. But he had survived not just the attack itself, but the aftermath, the long process of rebuilding body and mind. As darkness fell over Santa Barbara Harbor, Michael raised his glass in a silent toast to Windseeker, to the Coast Guard team that had found him, to the medical professionals who had saved his leg and helped heal his mind, to Ray and the harbor community that had supported his recovery, and finally, with a complex mix of respect and defiance, to the great white that had fundamentally altered the course of his life. Tomorrow would bring more physical therapy, more adaptations, more small steps forward. The complete story of his encounter would remain largely between himself and the ocean, the official reports documenting only the basics, the media coverage having long since moved on to fresher sensations. The reality of those terrifying hours, known fully only to him and the predator that had tested him. Michael Brennan had not emerged unchanged from his trial at sea, but he had emerged. And for tonight, that was enough.